There is a kind of silence that only grief can produce. Not the peaceful kind, not the hush of a Sunday morning or the quiet after a hard rain. I mean the silence that fills a room when everyone is holding their breath because they are waiting for something to break. That is the silence I sat inside on the morning of February the 11th, in a leather chair that smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish, inside an attorney's office I had never visited before in my life. My hands were folded in my lap. I could feel the thin gold band on my ring finger, the one I still wore, even though Harold had been gone for 9 years. I pressed it into my palm the way I always do when I need something to hold onto. Across the mahogany table, my daughter-in-law Renee sat with her sister beside her. She was dressed in black, as we all were. Her hair was pulled back smooth, not a strand out of place, and she wore pearl earrings that I recognized immediately, pearls that my son Marcus had given her for their 5th anniversary, because he told me so himself, proud as any man I had ever seen. She had not looked at me once since we arrived. Not in the parking lot. Not in the elevator. Not when the receptionist handed us both a small cup of water with a kind smile that didn't know what it was walking into. I watched her from the corner of my eye the way you watch a storm gathering on the horizon. You don't stare directly at it. You just keep it in your peripheral vision. Because you know it's coming. My son Marcus died on a Wednesday. I want you to understand that sentence the way I had to understand it, slowly, because the mind will not absorb it all at once. A mother's mind, especially. The human brain is merciful that way. It lets the truth in through a small door, one piece at a time, because if the whole of it arrived at once, I do not believe a person could survive it. He was 41 years old. He had his father's laugh and my mother's eyes. He drove a blue truck that he kept cleaner than most people keep their living rooms, and every Sunday, without fail, for as long as he lived 15 minutes from me, he would call at 9 in the morning, just to check in. Not to ask for anything, just to hear my voice. Just to say, "Mama, you good?" He died of a cardiac event. That is what the hospital called it. His heart stopped. A man with no prior diagnosis, no warning signs anyone had caught, no history, and his heart simply stopped while he was sitting at his desk at work on an ordinary Wednesday morning in October. His coworkers thought he had fallen asleep. That is how quietly it happened. I got the call from Renee at 12:47 in the afternoon. I know the time because I had just put a pot of soup on the stove and I glanced at the clock on the microwave as I reached for the phone. She said, "Mom," and she always called me Mom, had from the very first year, "Mom, something happened to Marcus." And something in the flatness of her voice, the way the words came out measured and already finished, told me that what she meant was, Marcus is gone. I turned off the soup. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't remember deciding to sit. I just found myself there, with my back against the cabinet and the linoleum cold through my slacks. That was 3 months before I found myself in that attorney's office. 3 months of casseroles from neighbors. 3 months of sorting through his things with hands that weren't ready. 3 months of Renee saying the right words at the right times. "Thank you for coming. He would have loved this. You're so strong, Mom." While something in the back of my mind turned quietly, like a wheel that wouldn't stop. I want to be honest with you, because that is all I know how to be. I did not dislike Renee. I want to say that plainly. In the early years, I genuinely loved her. She was sharp and funny, and she made my son smile in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was a boy. She had ambition, real ambition, and I respected it. She worked in finance, managed accounts, understood money in a way that always made me a little proud, my daughter-in-law, the one who knows what a portfolio is. We cooked Thanksgiving dinner together 3 years running. We shared a table and wine and laughter. But somewhere around year 5 or 6, something shifted. I could not have named it then. It was nothing dramatic. It was more like the light changing in a room, the same furniture, the same walls, but something in the quality of the warmth was different. She stopped calling me first. She stopped asking about my garden or my sister Ruth or the small things that make up a life. Marcus would still come by on Sundays. But Renee was always busy. Sorry, she sends her love. I told myself it was the pressure of their lives. People get busy. Marriages go through seasons. I told myself a lot of things. And then Marcus died, and the season I had been waiting to end became permanent. Now here we sat. The attorney, a composed man named Gerald Whitmore, silver-haired, with the careful stillness of someone who has delivered difficult news before, cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. He glanced at both sides of the table the way a referee looks at two teams before a game. And then he began to read. The first few items were simple enough. Marcus had a savings account, modest, but responsible, the way he always was. He had a life insurance policy through his employer that named Renee as the primary beneficiary, and Mr. Whitmore noted this with a brief nod in her direction. She received it without expression, just a small tilt of her chin, like she was checking something off a list she had already prepared in her mind. There were personal items, his watch collection, which he left to his younger cousin Darnell, who used to sit at Marcus's feet as a boy and listen to him explain the mechanics of an automatic movement like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. His tools and woodworking equipment went to my brother Leon, who had first put a hammer in Marcus's hand when he was 7 years old. These small details were read aloud in Mr. Whitmore's measured voice, and I felt each one like a pressed flower, delicate, preserved, heartbreaking in its specificity. Renee's sister, a woman named Claudette who had always watched me with the particular wariness of someone who has been briefed, shifted in her seat beside Renee. She had her arms crossed and her eyes moved around the room the way eyes do when they are waiting for the part that matters. I kept my hands folded. I kept my breathing even. Mr. Whitmore turned a page. With regard to the primary marital residence, located at 4814 Sycamore Glen Drive. I heard Renee exhale beside me, not dramatically, just the small release of someone who has been holding tension and believes they are about to be relieved of it. The property, including the structure, the land, and all contents therein not previously enumerated, is hereby bequeathed in full to my mother, Mrs. Loretta Jean Beaumont. The room did not erupt. That is not what happened. What happened was that particular silence I described to you at the beginning. The held breath. The stopped clock. The moment before the glass hits the floor. And then Renee said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Whitmore did not flinch. I imagine he had been in rooms like this before. He repeated the line clearly, his voice neither apologetic nor unkind. He said my name again, Mrs. Loretta Jean Beaumont, as if hearing it twice would make it more real. That is not possible, Renee said. Her voice had changed. The careful composure she had carried in with her, the pressed black dress, the smooth hair, the pearl earrings began to loosen at the edges. We have been married for 8 years. That house is our home. There must be an error. There is no error, Mr. Whitmore said. The will was amended and duly notarized 6 months prior to Mr. Beaumont's passing. It is entirely valid under state law. 6 months. I turned that number over in my mind like a stone. 6 months before he died, which meant approximately 4 months after something must have happened. Something that caused my son, a man who was private and methodical and not given to impulsive decisions, to sit down with an attorney and quietly change the most significant document of his adult life. Claudette put her hand on Renee's arm. Renee, don't what? Renee's voice rose just slightly. Not a shout, she was too controlled for that, but there was something underneath the surface now, pressing up. Don't ask why my husband left his own house to his mother instead of his wife. Don't ask why no one told me. I lived in that house. My things are in that house. She turned to look at me then, for the first time since we had arrived. And I want to tell you what I saw in her face, because it would be easy to describe it as guilt or anger or grief. People in moments like this wear all three at once. What I saw in Renee's face was something more complicated than any of those. I saw the expression of someone who had made a calculation, a long, careful calculation, and had just discovered that someone else had been calculating too. Did you know? She asked me. Her voice was low. Did he tell you? No, I said. And that was the truth. Marcus had not told me a word. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat again, gently, the way a teacher redirects a classroom. There is one additional item, he said. Attached to the amended will is a sealed letter, written by Mr. Beaumont and notarized at the same time as the amendment. He requested that it be opened and read aloud in the presence of all named parties at the time of this reading. He reached into the folder and produced an envelope. Cream-colored, sealed with wax, a burgundy wax seal pressed with what I recognized immediately as the initial M. Marcus had a wax seal kit that he bought at an antique shop years ago, just because he thought it was interesting. He used it for birthday cards sometimes, for Christmas letters. He pressed it into the wax of that envelope the same way he pressed it into everything he touched, with deliberate care, with attention, with the quiet thoroughness that had been his nature since he was old enough to tie his own shoes. Mr. Whitmore held the envelope across the table toward me. He requested, the attorney said, that his mother be the one to read it aloud. I looked at that envelope for a long moment. I could feel Renee watching me. I could feel Claudette watching me. I could feel the weight of everything that had already been said and everything that was about to be. I reached out and took the envelope from Mr. Whitmore's hands. My son had given me one last thing to hold. I was not going to let it go. I turned the envelope over in my hands once before I opened it. The wax seal was firm. He had pressed it deep, the way he did everything with intention. I ran my thumb across the raised M and felt something move through me that I cannot fully name. Not quite grief. Not quite pride. Something older than both. The feeling a mother gets when she realizes her child knew something she didn't, handled something alone that he should not have had to carry by himself, and did it with grace anyway. I thought about calling him in that moment. I thought, the way the grieving mind plays its cruelest tricks, I need to ask Marcus about this. And then the room came back to me. The lemon polish smell. The mahogany table. Mr. Whitmore's careful hands. I slid my finger under the seal. The letter was written by hand. 3 pages, front and back, in Marcus's handwriting, that particular mix of print and cursive that he developed in middle school and never fully abandoned. His letters leaned slightly to the right, like they were walking into a wind. I used to tease him about it when he was young. Boy, your writing looks like it's trying to get somewhere. I smoothed the pages against the table. I looked up once at Renee, whose eyes were fixed on the letter with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger anymore. It was something closer to dread. I began to read. Mama, and just that one word almost undid me, but I kept my voice steady. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for the pain that has brought you to this room. I need you to know that I did not make this decision lightly, and I did not make it in anger. I made it because I knew the truth, and I believed the truth deserved to have a witness. So I am asking you now to be that witness for me one last time. I am going to tell you some things that will be difficult to hear. I am going to ask you to hear them with the same dignity you have shown in every hard moment of your life. I learned how to face hard things by watching you. I hope I have done you credit. Mama, my marriage was in trouble. I want to say that plainly, because there is no kind way to say it, and I have learned that kind ways of saying hard things only delay the pain they carry. Renee and I had been struggling for over a year before I went to speak with Mr. Whitmore. I knew that. What I did not know, not until I found out in a way I will describe to you, was the full shape of what I was dealing with. In March of last year, I noticed discrepancies in our joint account. Small at first, amounts I might have attributed to rounding errors or forgotten purchases if I were not the kind of man who checks his statements. I am, as you know, exactly that kind of man. I did not say anything immediately. I watched. I documented. Over a period of approximately 6 weeks, I tracked a total of $31,000 moved out of our shared accounts in increments, never large enough to trigger an automatic alert, always timed to coincide with days when I traveled for work. I want to be careful how I write this next part, because I do not want to sound like a man consumed by bitterness. I was hurt. Of course I was hurt. But more than hurt, I was clear-eyed. And what I saw clearly was this. My wife was preparing to leave me. She was not preparing in the way people prepare when they are honest. A conversation, a counselor, a difficult evening at the kitchen table. She was preparing the way someone prepares when they intend to leave with an advantage. I paused here. Not because I lost my composure, I promised myself I would not, but because the room needed a moment to absorb what it had just heard. I could hear Claudette exhale sharply through her nose. I did not look at Renee. I looked at the page. I continued. I hired someone to help me understand what I was looking at. I want to be honest about that, Mama, because you raised me to own my choices. I hired a private financial investigator, a woman named Carol Sims, who came recommended through a colleague. She spent 3 weeks reviewing what I brought her. At the end of those 3 weeks, she confirmed what I had suspected. The money had been moved systematically and deliberately. It had been transferred into an account I had no knowledge of and no access to. An account opened 18 months prior. There was something else Carol found. I will say this plainly because the letter is not the place for softening. Renee had been in a relationship with someone else. I will not put his name here because it does not matter, and because I am not interested in directing anyone's anger toward a man who is simply the destination of a journey my wife had already decided to take. What matters is that the relationship had been ongoing for approximately 14 months. What matters is that decisions about our home, our finances, and our future were being made by a woman who had already, in her own heart, left the marriage. The house on Sycamore Glen Drive was bought with money my grandfather left me. Every down payment dollar, every renovation, every repair came from that inheritance and from my own labor. It was never marital property in the way some property is built together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. It was mine, brought into the marriage as a gift I offered freely. I am taking it back, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Mama, I am leaving you the house because it is the safest place I know. Because you're the safest person I know. Because I trust you to decide what to do with it better than I trust any courtroom or any process that would have come after me. I am not asking you to punish anyone. I am only asking you to receive what I am giving you and to know that I gave it with love. I set the second page down. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady, deliberate, the way Marcus himself would have wanted it. I did not look at Renee yet. I picked up the third page. The third page was shorter than the others. Marcus's handwriting on it was slightly different, the letters a little more deliberate, like he had slowed down when he reached this part. Like he had chosen each word the way you choose stones to step across a river. Carefully, one at a time. There was something else Carol found. I will say this plainly because the letter is not the place for softening. Renee had been in a relationship with someone else. I will not put his name here because it does not matter, and because I am not interested in directing anyone's anger toward a man who is simply the destination of a journey my wife had already decided to take. What matters is that the relationship had been ongoing for approximately 14 months. What matters is that decisions about our home, our finances, and our future were being made by a woman who had already, in her own heart, left the marriage. The house on Sycamore Glen Drive was bought with money my grandfather left me. Every down payment dollar, every renovation, every repair came from that inheritance and from my own labor. It was never marital property in the way some property is built together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. It was mine, brought into the marriage as a gift I offered freely. I am taking it back, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Mama, I am leaving you the house because it is the safest place I know. Because you're the safest person I know. Because I trust you to decide what to do with it better than I trust any courtroom or any process that would have come after me. I am not asking you to punish anyone. I am only asking you to receive what I am giving you and to know that I gave it with love. I set the second page down. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady, deliberate, the way Marcus himself would have wanted it. I did not look at Renee yet. I picked up the third page. The third page was shorter than the others. Marcus's handwriting on it was slightly different, the letters a little more deliberate, like he had slowed down when he reached this part. Like he had chosen each word the way you choose stones to step across a river. Carefully, one at a time. I smoothed it against the table the same way I had smoothed the others, and I took one breath before I continued. There are a few more things I want to say, and I will say them briefly because I have never been a man who believed in using more words than a thing requires. To Renee, I do not hate you. I want that said in front of whatever witnesses are in that room, because I mean it. I spent a long time trying to understand what happened between us, and I think the most honest thing I can say is that people change in directions they do not always choose, and sometimes the person you become is no longer compatible with the life you built. I could have lived with that. What I could not live with was the deception. Not the leaving, the lying. The slow, careful, deliberate construction of an exit while I was still standing in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, believing we were still trying. If you had come to me, Renee, if you had sat down across from me and said, "Marcus, I am not happy, Marcus, I need something different," I would have grieved it, but I would have respected it. I would have let you go with dignity. You did not give me that chance. And so I made the only decision I had left to make with the information I had. I hope you find what you were looking for. I genuinely mean that. To my mother, I know this is not the inheritance you wanted from me. I know you would have traded every house, every account, every possession I ever owned for one more Sunday phone call. I know that, Mama, because I know you. And I want you to know that I knew it while I was alive, that you loved me that purely, that completely, without condition or calculation. Not everyone gets that from their mother. I never took it for granted. Take care of the garden if you move in. The tomatoes need more water than you'd think. I love you. I always have. I always will. In whatever way love persists beyond the places we can see. Your son, Marcus. I folded the letter along its original creases. I set it on the table in front of me. And then I sat with my hands in my lap and I let the room be what it was. I did not cry. I want you to understand that, not because I was not grieving, but because the grief I carried that morning was too large for tears. Tears are for the moments when emotion finds a release valve. What I felt sitting in that chair, having just read my dead son's words aloud to the woman who had betrayed him, was something that had moved past the need for release. It had settled. It had become weight instead of water. Something I would carry forward rather than shed. Claudette was the first one to speak. "This is contestable," she said. Her voice was sharp and immediate, like she had been preparing the sentence while I read. Awil changed 6 months before death, under what could have been emotional duress. Any attorney worth their fee will tell you this can be challenged. Mr. Whitmore looked at her with the patience of a man who has heard this particular speech before. "You are welcome to seek independent counsel," he said simply. The document was prepared and notarized by this office. Mr. Beaumont was of sound mind and was not under any documented duress at the time of signing. The amendment is legally sound. He was clearly Claudette. Renee's voice, when it came, was quiet, almost inaudible. Claudette stopped. We all looked at Renee. She was staring at the folded letter on the table in front of me. Her hands were flat on the surface of the mahogany, palms down, fingers spread, the posture of someone trying to keep themselves from floating away. The pearl earrings caught the light from the window behind her. I watched her face move through something, a sequence of expressions too fast and too private to fully read, and then settle into something I had not expected. Not anger. Not defiance. Something that looked, if I am honest, very much like shame. "He knew," she said. Not to me. Not to the room. To herself, or to the letter, or to something only she could see. He knew the whole time. Nobody answered her. Because there was nothing to answer. Marcus had answered it himself, in ink, in his leaning handwriting, sealed with burgundy wax. He had known. He had said his piece with the careful, quiet thoroughness that had defined him from the time he was a boy reorganizing his baseball cards in alphabetical order. From the time he saved for 6 months to buy his first tool set rather than asking anyone to give it to him. He had handled it the way he handled everything alone, deliberately, and completely. I picked up the letter and placed it in my purse. Mr. Whitmore passed me several documents to sign: acknowledgement of bequest, confirmation of receipt, a form authorizing the transfer of the property deed into my name. I signed each one in the careful cursive my own mother had insisted I practice until it was something I could be proud of. When I had signed the last page, I clicked the pen closed and set it on the table, and I finally looked at Renee directly. She was still staring at the space where the letter had been. I did not say anything unkind. I did not say anything triumphant. I am not that kind of woman, and Marcus was not that kind of son. He had not written that letter to weaponize me. He had written it to tell the truth, and the truth had been told. What I said to Renee, in a voice I kept low and even, was this: "He loved you, even at the end. I want you to carry that." She looked at me then. Her eyes were bright with something she was holding back. I gathered my things and stood. The drive home from Mr. Whitmore's office took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, the way you fix your eyes on something small and concrete when the larger world has become too overwhelming to look at directly. 23 minutes of bare winter trees along the highway median. 23 minutes of the heater running low and the radio off, and my sister Ruth in the passenger seat beside me, not saying a word. Because Ruth has known me for 67 years, and she understands that there are moments when the most loving thing one person can offer another is simply their presence, without the weight of language. She had been in that office with me. I had asked her to come, not for support, exactly, though she provided it. I had asked her because Marcus had loved his Aunt Ruth with a particular fierceness, the way children sometimes attach to the aunt or uncle who treats them like a small adult, who slips them an extra piece of pie and asks their opinion on things. Ruth had cried quietly through the reading of the letter, one hand pressed over her mouth. She had not made a sound. That was her dignity, and it matched mine. When we pulled into my driveway, she finally spoke. "You all right?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I will be." She nodded. That was enough for both of us. Inside, my house smelled like the candle I had left burning on the kitchen counter, vanilla and something faintly woody, a scent Marcus had once said made him think of being small, of doing homework at the same kitchen table while I cooked. I stood in the doorway for a moment just breathing it in, letting it be evidence that the world was still continuous. That the morning I had just survived connected to this afternoon, to this smell, to this ordinary kitchen where ordinary life had always found a way to continue. I sat at the table and I stayed there for a long time. In the days that followed, I learned what it means to be the subject of a story that other people are telling without you. Marcus's friends heard. His co-workers heard. People from the neighborhood where he and Renee had lived for 6 years, neighbors who had waved from driveways, borrowed ladders, shared holiday cookies, began to piece together what had happened in that attorney's office from whatever version reached them first. I do not know what Renee told people. I did not seek out that information. I have found, in my years on this earth, that the versions of a story that travel fastest are rarely the most accurate ones, and that the truth has a way of arriving eventually on its own, slower but steadier, like a season changing. What I did receive in those days were phone calls. Marcus's friend Deshawn called me on a Thursday evening. Deshawn had been Marcus's closest friend since college, a tall, quiet man who built furniture in his spare time and had delivered the most beautiful eulogy I had ever heard at Marcus's funeral, speaking for 12 minutes without notes, without faltering, as though he had been rehearsing it his whole life without knowing why. He called to tell me that he had known something was wrong with Marcus in the months before he died. That Marcus had been quieter than usual. That he had said once, over a beer on Deshawn's porch, "I'm dealing with something, D. I'll tell you when it's settled." It never settled. He ran out of time before it could. Deshawn cried on the phone. Not dramatically, just the kind of crying that happens when a man has been holding something in long enough that it simply needs somewhere to go. I listened. I told him that Marcus had loved him. I told him that the letter made clear that Marcus had faced what he needed to face and made his peace with it. That he had not died confused or defeated. That he had died with his affairs in order and his heart, whatever pain it held, still intact. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a while. I thought about what it must have cost Marcus to know what he knew and continue to show up to his life every day. To go to work. To come home. To maintain the surface of things while underneath he was making quiet, careful preparations. I thought about whether he was lonely in that, whether he wished he had told me sooner, whether the privacy of it was a burden or a protection. I decided, after some time, that it was both. He was my son. He had my tendency to carry things alone until they were finished. I recognized it because I had passed it to him, and I felt the particular complicated grief of seeing your own nature reflected in someone you love, proud of their strength and heartbroken that it cost them something. 2 weeks after the reading of the will, I drove to Sycamore Glen Drive for the first time. I had a key, Mr. Whitmore had provided it, but I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before I used it. The house was a modest colonial, cream-colored with black shutters and a front porch that Marcus had rebuilt with his own hands 2 summers ago. I remembered him calling me on a Sunday morning to describe the progress. "Mama, I found this reclaimed wood at a salvage yard. You would not believe the quality of it. His voice lit up the way it got when he was building something, when he was making something last. There were still potted plants on the porch. Half of them had gone dry and brittle in the weeks since anyone had tended them. One, a deep green succulent in a terracotta pot near the door, had survived. Stubborn. Self-sufficient. Holding on without being watered. I thought, that is Marcus right there. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled like him. Faintly, the cedar of his closet, the clean cotton of laundered things, something underneath it all that was simply him, the particular atmosphere a person leaves behind in the rooms they have loved and lived in. I stood in the front hallway, and I pressed my hand flat against the wall the way you press your hand against the chest of someone you love. I just needed to feel that it was real. That he had been here. That some part of him still was. I walked through every room that first day. Not quickly, not the way you move through a space when you are cataloging or assessing or deciding. Slowly. The way you move through a place when you are trying to memorize it. When you understand that the memorizing is the point. The living room had Marcus's bookshelves along the east wall floor to ceiling, the kind he had built himself from that same reclaimed wood he loved, filled with the particular mix of titles that had always made me smile when I visited. History books beside detective novels, beside thick volumes on woodworking technique, beside a worn paperback copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God that I had given him when he was 17 and that had clearly been read more than once. Its spine soft and cracked with use. I pulled it from the shelf and held it. Inside the front cover, in my own handwriting from 24 years ago, for Marcus, so you know that some journeys are worth taking even when the road is hard. Love, Mama. He had kept it. All those years, through college and first apartments and the move into this house, he had kept it on his shelf where he could see it. I put it in my purse next to his letter. The kitchen was clean and orderly the way Marcus kept everything. There were dishes in the drying rack, washed and stacked, the last dishes he had used before a Wednesday morning took him from us. I did not move them. I stood at the sink and looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden he had planted 3 years ago along the south-facing fence. Even in February, the bones of it were visible, the raised beds he had built, the trellis for climbing things, the bare canes of what I recognized as knockout roses because Marcus had called me the day he planted them to ask which variety I preferred. I had said knockout roses. He had planted knockout roses. I turned on the faucet and ran water over my hands for no reason except that I needed to do something physical, something ordinary, something that connected me to the simple fact of being alive in a world that had become suddenly and permanently different. It was in the kitchen that I found the first sign of what had already begun. On the counter near the refrigerator was a notepad, the kind Marcus kept for grocery lists, the spiral-bound kind with a rooster on the cover because I had given him a set of them as a joke gift one Christmas, a reference to an old family story about his grandfather and a particularly aggressive rooster named Gerald. He had laughed for 5 minutes straight when he opened that gift. I had not been able to give him anything since without thinking of that laugh. The top page of the notepad had writing on it. Not Marcus's handwriting. Renee's. A list. Written in her precise, slanted script. Bedroom furniture, check with Claudette kitchen appliances, keep KitchenAid, mixer, Vitamix art pieces, photograph, before moving files, home office, top drawer safe, combination. The list went on for several more lines. At the bottom, a date. Written 3 days after Marcus's funeral. I stood looking at it for a long time. Then I took out my phone and photographed it. I folded the page carefully and placed it in my purse with the letter and the book. I was not sure yet what I would need. I had learned, in those weeks, to document first and decide later. I called Mr. Whitmore that afternoon. He was unsurprised. He told me that until the property deed was formally transferred into my name, a process already underway, I was legally entitled to notify Renee that the property was no longer accessible to her and to request that she arrange to collect her personal belongings through a formal process, with notice and not unilaterally. He used the word unilaterally with a particular emphasis that told me he had seen this kind of thing before. I asked him how long the transfer would take. He said 2 to 3 weeks, barring any legal challenge. I asked him whether he anticipated a legal challenge. He paused, the careful pause of an attorney who knows more than he can say directly. I would prepare for the possibility, he told me. But I would not be overly concerned about it. The challenge came 8 days later. A letter arrived at my home address, formal, from a law firm I did not recognize, informing me that Renee intended to contest the amended will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. The letter was 3 pages long and used a great many words to say, essentially, that someone must have pressured Marcus into changing his will, because surely he would not have done so of his own free accord. I read the letter twice. Then I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor who had handled Harold's estate when he passed, and who I had stayed in contact with because she was exactly the kind of person you want to know, precise, calm, and completely without patience for nonsense. Patricia read the letter and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They have nothing. Undue influence requires evidence of external pressure. Diminished capacity requires medical documentation. Marcus was a healthy man who prepared this document with a licensed attorney present. They're hoping the cost and stress of litigation will convince you to settle." "I will not be settling," I said. "I know," Patricia said, and I could hear the small smile in her voice. "I'll draft the response today." What happened next moved both faster and slower than I expected, the way legal things do, lurching forward in sudden bursts and then going quiet for weeks at a time. Patricia filed our response. Mr. Whitmore provided his documentation. The financial investigator Carol Sims, whose report Marcus had referenced in his letter, was contacted and confirmed she could provide her findings as supporting evidence if necessary. It did not become necessary. 6 weeks after the challenge was filed, Renee's attorneys withdrew it. I was sitting in my kitchen when Patricia called to tell me. The soup was on the stove, a different soup from the one I had been making the day I got the call about Marcus, but soup nonetheless, because some habits are deeper than grief. I turned down the heat and listened to Patricia's voice, and when she finished I thanked her and set the phone on the counter. I stood at the stove and I stirred the soup and I let myself feel, for the first time since October, something that was not grief or shock or the particular exhaustion of legal battle. What I felt was done. Not happy. Not triumphant. Not vindicated in any loud or satisfying way. Just done. The way a storm is done. The way a long night is done when the sky begins, slowly and without fanfare, to lighten at the edges. Spring came the way it always does in this part of the world, not all at once, but in small permissions. First, the light changes. It stays a little longer each evening, stretching itself out like something waking from a long sleep. Then the ground softens. Then one morning you step outside and there is something in the air, not quite warmth yet, but the promise of it. The suggestion. And something in your body responds before your mind does. Some deep animal part of you that has been wading through the cold without knowing it was waiting. I moved into the house on Sycamore Glen Drive in late March. I did not do it immediately after the legal matter was resolved. I gave myself time. I went back several more times before I moved, sometimes with Ruth, sometimes alone, and I walked through the room slowly, the way I had that first day, letting myself become accustomed to the idea that this place was mine now. That my son had given it to me not as a consolation prize, not out of grief or impulse, but out of love and clarity and the particular wisdom of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I brought things from my own home gradually. A quilt my mother had made. The kitchen table where Marcus had done his homework. Photographs. The small details that make a house into something that holds you rather than simply containing you. The garden was the first thing I tended. I went out on a Saturday morning in early April with gloves and a trowel, and I spent 3 hours in the raised beds, turning the soil, pulling the winter's debris, making room. The knockout roses along the fence had already begun to bud small, tight, red-tip things that would not fully open for another few weeks, but were already committed to the process of becoming. I talked to them while I worked. I am not embarrassed to tell you that. I have talked to plants my whole life, and I have found them to be excellent listeners. I talked to Marcus too. Not in any mystical way. I am a practical woman, and I do not make claims about what exists beyond what I can see. But there is something about tending a garden that a person you loved planted with their own hands that makes the distance between the living and the gone feel, For a little while, navigable. Like the soil is a kind of common ground. Like the work of your hands is a conversation in a language that does not require words. I planted tomatoes in the bed along the south fence. More water than you'd think, he had written. I remembered. Renee moved out of state that summer. I heard this from Deshawn, who heard it from someone else, the way news travels in the web of people who loved Marcus. I do not know where she went. I did not ask. I had meant what I said to her in that attorney's office, that I hoped she found what she was looking for, and I found, as the months passed, that I meant it more rather than less. Grief has a way of clarifying things, of burning away the aspects of an emotion that are really just performance, the anger you display because it gives you something to do with your hands, the bitterness you maintain because releasing it would mean feeling the sadness underneath. When those things burned away, what I was left with regarding Renee was something simpler and sadder than anger. I was left with the image of a woman who had been loved genuinely and completely by a good man and had not known how to receive it, or had decided somewhere along the way that it was not enough, or had simply become someone different from the woman who had first said yes to my son across some candlelit table I had not been present for. People do that. They change. It is not always villainous. It is not always kind. What was not acceptable, what Marcus himself had named plainly in his letter, was the deception. The slow, deliberate construction of an exit while someone else was still standing in the same house believing in the same future. That is the part that cannot be softened or explained away, and Marcus had not tried to soften it. He had named it, documented it, and handled it with the kind of measured, sorrowful precision that I recognized as his finest quality. He had faced the truth without flinching. I was trying to do the same. On a Sunday morning in September, almost exactly a year after Marcus died, I sat on the front porch of the house on Sycamore Glen Drive with a cup of coffee and the early light coming through the oak tree at the edge of the yard, breaking into pieces on the porch floor the way light does when it comes through leaves, shifting and dappled and alive. My phone rang at 9 o'clock. Of course it did not. Of course it was not Marcus. But I sat with the coffee anyway, in the quiet, in the light, and I did what I have done every Sunday morning since October. I said good morning to him. Out loud, quietly, to the yard and the roses and the particular quality of a Sunday in September that felt, somehow, like something he would have appreciated. I told him the tomatoes had been extraordinary this year. I told him the porch was holding up beautifully, that reclaimed wood of his, solid as the day he laid it. I told him that I was all right, that I was not what I was before, because you cannot lose a child and remain unchanged. The self that existed before that loss is not recoverable, and I had stopped trying to recover it. What I was building instead was something new, made from the same materials, but arranged differently, shaped by what I had been through, stronger in the broken places, the way things sometimes are. I told him I was proud of him. I told him I always had been. And then I finished my coffee in the quiet, and I went inside to start my day, in the house my son left me, in the life I was still, slowly, learning to live. There is something I want to say to you before we part ways today. I have told you a story about inheritance, about property and wills and legal documents and the cold architecture of how we distribute what we leave behind. But I want you to understand that none of that is what this story is really about. This story is about a man who faced one of the most painful discoveries a person can face inside a marriage. The discovery that the person beside you has been quietly becoming a stranger, has been making plans that do not include you, has been treating the life you built together as something to be managed rather than honored. And instead of erupting, instead of collapsing, instead of any of the 100 understandable human responses to that kind of pain, he got quiet. He got clear. He made his decisions carefully, and he sealed them with burgundy wax, and he trusted his mother to carry the truth into a room he would never be able to enter himself. That is not a story about a house. That is a story about dignity. I think about the choices we make when we discover we have been betrayed, whether we let the bitterness reshape us, whether we reach for revenge in ways that ultimately diminish us, whether we find some third option that is neither surrender nor destruction. Marcus found that third option. He did not get enough time to see how it resolved. But he made his choices as though time were not a guarantee, as though the only thing he could control was the integrity of his own actions. I try to live that way now. I do not always succeed, but I try. If you are sitting with your own betrayal today, a marriage that is not what it appears, a family member who has taken more than they were given, a trust that has been quietly and methodically broken, I want you to know that the truth has weight. It persists. It finds its way into rooms and it speaks, even when the person who discovered it is no longer there to speak it themselves. And if you are a mother, if you have a child you love with that particular ferocity that has no parallel in human experience, hold them a little closer today. Call them if you haven't. Say the things that don't need an occasion. Because the Sunday morning calls are the things you will miss most. They always are. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that attorney's office? Would you have read that letter aloud? Would you have said what I said to Renee at the end? And if you are new here and this is the first story of mine you have heard, welcome. There are many more where this came from. Subscribe and stay close. Auntie May always has something to tell you. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.